So welcome everyone to the Hingham Heritage Museum. My name is Deirdre Anderson, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society. We are so grateful to so many familiar faces who've been subscribers to this year's Waves of Change lecture series, put together so ably by our Education Committee, represented here today by Eileen McIntyre, greeting people at the door, Elizabeth Danis, who will be up shortly, and Andy Hertig. So we're very grateful for our Education Committee who put this program together. Before I turn it over to our Education Committee, I just want to update you on a couple happenings of the Hingham Historical Society. For those of you who subscribe to the Hingham Journal or are online, you would see this week that we received some very positive news from the Town of Hingham's Community Preservation Committee. They are recommending to town meeting, Monday, April 27th, 7 p.m., Hingham High School. They are recommending to town meeting that the town grant $772,000 of the Community Preservation Trust Fund to the purchase of the Benjamin Lincoln House at 181 North Street. Thank you. We will be working very, very hard over the next several years to triple and quadruple that amount to be sure that the ownership of that National Historic Landmark, as well as this spectacular building and Old Ordinary, can weather any financial storm. So we thank you in advance for your support of that project, and please see me or any of our board members if you have any questions. On February 8th, Saturday, we invite all of you to join us for Hingham High School's National History Day competition. Many of you in this room have served as judges. Hingham High School juniors that have made it past their teacher's vote will come and show their work here as a second step before they go to regional, state, and hopefully for some, national competition. It's a wonderful way to have hope for the future. And again, that's National History Day. Will be held here on Saturday, February 8th from 11 to 3 p.m. And then the following Saturday, February 15th, please join us at Old Ship Meeting House for our annual Lincoln Day commemoration. And if you wanted to know all things Lincoln, Paula Bagger, our president of our board, is going to be giving the keynote address about Benjamin Lincoln and his family at 181 North Street. So it's a wonderful primer, as well as, of course, our commemoration and wreath laying at Benjamin Lincoln's grave and at the Lincoln statue in Fountain Square. So that's it for our upcoming events. I am grateful for your presence. Here is Eileen McIntyre, Andy Hertig, to introduce today's speaker. Andy, thanks.
For a lecture series entitled Waves of Change, what could be a more appropriate topic than transportation, since we seem to be on the verge now of redefining our traditional relationship with fossil fuels and the automobile. Massive traffic jams, self-driving cars, the possible demise of the internal combustion engine, all of this suggests major changes are ahead. And what better person to depict these changes as how they affected Hingham than Bob Malme, our speaker this afternoon. Bob grew up in Hingham, and having earned his bachelor's degree at Tufts in political science, he's intimately familiar with the Boston area. But he has expanded his point of view with a degree in public policy from Duke University, where he stayed on for 18 years as a researcher, focusing in part on the construction of local transportation systems. He returned to Massachusetts in 2010 to earn a degree in library science and archival management at Simmons, and since 2013 he has worked as an archivist here at the Historical Society, helping to manage our collections and bring to light some of the treasures in the collection. And we are privileged this afternoon to experience some of the fruits of his labors in a fascinating presentation of slides and excerpts from local newspapers, which trace the evolution of transportation in Hingham from the horse and buggy to the steamboat, to the railroad, to the electric trolley, and finally, the automobile. Bob tells me that his presentation will be about an hour, followed by questions, and then we'll adjourn downstairs for refreshments. And may I also remind you, please, to turn off your cell phones before we begin. So, with no more information, please join me in welcoming Bob Malme.
Good afternoon. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for all for coming. Thanks, Andy, for that gracious introduction. Thanks to Eileen and I speak to now. Okay, I can speak now a bit better. Okay, thank you. Also thank Eileen McIntyre for helping with some of my research on this project. I've been glad that a lot of you could come out in the severe New England winter day. And I know some of you have probably given up your traditional family gathering for the Pro Bowl today, so I'm glad you could make it. Well, speak a little louder. Yes, okay. I'll hold the mic up a little bit more here. Can you hear me now? Okay, well, thank you. As Andy suggested, I'll be looking at 100 years of Hingham transportation history, starting with about 1850 and moving on. And given this the long period of time we're talking about an hour to talk to you about it, I decided to split it into 4 25-year periods. We'll start out with the 1850 to 1875 period, talk about the limited options that were available in Hingham at that time. We'll move on to the late 19th century to talk about the new improved modes appeared with the Industrial Revolution era, and then we'll talk about the 20th century, the arrival of the horseless carriage and the effect on other modes of transportation. And finally, 1926 to 1950, we'll talk about the available trains, and we'll talk about planes and a lot of automobiles. Okay, so we'll start out in 1850, or in this case, actually this is a map put together in 1830, just showing the town at that time, put together by Reuben Hersey and Jedediah Lincoln. Shows the town structure at the time. Hingham was a largely, rural town, about 4,000 population at that time. A mixture of agriculture and light industries, particularly involving the wooden buckets, et cetera, which you may already know about. And as you can see from this, some of the streets that didn't exist at that time, you see from the map, include like Central Street, Cushing, Downer Avenue, much of the streets surrounding Foucault Point, Lincoln Street to Weymouth, and Oda Street and Winter Street in the surrounding areas. Here we have initial two, from the beginning of the town to this point, basically two options you really had to get around town were by horse or by foot. So we'll talk about horse transportation first. First, I should tell you that many of the photos we have in this section are from actually later periods in time. There weren't a lot of, photography was in its infancy, and so there wasn't a lot of photos from that period of time in our collection, but I'll try to do illustrative of the various things with these other photos. So here we have what is probably a fashionable Hingham gentleman traveling, what fashionable Hingham gentleman traveled through town in about 1890 on Hingham streets. And if you did travel by horse, you of course had a choice of doing it either on horseback, by yourself, or as this older gentleman doing probably one of the hills of Hingham unidentified around 1890, or you could do it behind a carriage, in a carriage behind a horse or two. There's two men at the harbor somewhere behind a horse and a carriage. And or if you didn't have a carriage, you'd always hire one from the local livery stables that might be available, or you could take a ride in one of the various stages that ran. The stage, for instance, here ran typically from the Steamboat docks to Hingham Center in South Hingham. And of course, Hingham, the carriage and the horse transportation area was more than just a horse and buggy show. It had other trades that were involved. The 1860 census tended to show a lot of the related businesses. This included horse harness makers, carriage makers, a lot of established Hingham names in this, including Humphrey and Witten for carriage makers, Loring for leather tanners, teamsters or transporters. We'll have a Hersey, a Hobart, and a Witten. Blacksmiths, there were 14. A lot of them needed for horseshoeing. So more than 60 of the 1,159 Hingham households at that time related to horse-related transportation. And there are lots of businesses. This is down near Hingham Center. This is a combination of livery stable and horseshoery place, a couple of businesses at that point just near Pear Tree Hill. And several businesses, according to one business here at Hingham Center. And of course, business driving around with business for pleasure. I take this as being a pleasure ride. A couple of people taking a photo in front of their carriage in front of the old ship church. Traveling around there, and if for businesses, you might consider something like a lot of express people, businesses around it allowed you to either originally to take freight from Boston to Hingham directly, and later on they basically went to the train stations and delivered packages and homes and to businesses from there. So, of course, if you didn't have a horse, for instance, you sort of picture the old days, everybody had a horse, but it was not necessarily the case. If you worked downtown, for instance, you didn't have a lot of land, you didn't have a barn, you couldn't have a place to keep a horse, you may not have it. And, of course, there was expense involved to owning a horse. While it may cost you about $10 to $15 to get one, it would probably be a lot more to provide it with food and whatever else it needed to keep it healthy. So that had to work into your budget, as well as buying a saddle, $20 to $50, or a buggy might run a typical one, $20 to $50 or more if you wanted a more fancier one. All this in 1860 when the average wage was about less than $6. So if you didn't have a horse, you ended up having to travel by foot. Here we see a gentleman crossing Main Street around 1900 in Hingham Center. Of course, you didn't always necessarily travel in the streets. You maybe, most of the time, you traveled with a path along the side of the road. Or this is a more fancier sidewalk I could find in our collection. This is looking at Elm Street, the corner of Main, looking west, and by the First Baptist Church. And you see there's some of the sidewalk along the right there, but it's basically just separated from the road by hitching posts for riders to the Sunday services to tie up their horse at the time. More often, you would just see a path along the side of the streets. Here you see some well-dressed, maybe Sunday-dressed women walking through about 1880, on an unidentified street in town. And since you might be traveling in the path, it may not necessarily be during good weather, and during rain, or you might have filled up with water, and you might be walking in the street. And if you did so, streets sort of looked like this would be what a common street would look like. This is taken at Main Street, looking at Glad Tidings Plain around 1890. A lot of ruddy roads, and this is on a perfectly nice day. Imagine if it had been raining or snowing or whatever. And so if you did have to walk, if you did have work to do, there's chronicles of residents of Tuttleville at the corner of High Street and Ward Street who had to walk miles to work every day. They're in Weymouth or in Hingham Square, and such. You had to do it in all sorts of weather, so it wasn't always easy. It could be raining a lot, or it could be a lot of snow on the streets here. This is taken downtown around 1900. And you see that not really plowed the street, so it looks like they plowed the sidewalk around the Lincoln Building. Okay, and you always had to be traveling. You had to be careful of other carriages and stuff in the street. What might have been, might have been in the street before you, whether it was a horse, or in this case, we have elephants traveling down Levitt Street. They're going to the agricultural fairgrounds around 1890. And so you might have to be careful of watching what you step in. So if you're traveling out of town, basically, historically, the two options you had was by take horse or by boat. Early on in Hingham history, by boat was the better choice because the roads were so bad. But around 1800, there were several turnpikes built in town, and the road improvements, so it made it easier to get into Boston, for instance, by horse and carriage. And boats before 1819, you had a packet boat or sailing boat that you could book packet passage on that you made daily and weekly trips into Boston for supplies. But they were, of course, largely reliant on the good weather to run. That sort of changed in 1819 with the development of the steamboat. And here you see probably 1880 passengers on one of the steamboats heading in or back to Hingham. The steamboat line formed in 1819, the Hingham and Boston Steamboat Company was the first known in the country. It ran a boat called the Eagle, and if you go downstairs on the second floor, there's sort of an illustration of the first steamboat down there. The Eagle lasted a couple of years, and then between about 1819 and 1830, the service was rather irregular. Several different boats showed up to transport people. Probably a lot of the regular duty was a new industry, new invention, and of course things break down a lot early on, so you couldn't always depend on the steam line. But by 1831, the steamship company was officially incorporated, and it started running a ship called the Benjamin Lincoln, and that sort of ran every hour and a half. It ran one boat, one in and out per day. It took them 1.5 hours to go in 7.5 cents each direction, 35 cents for both directions. And here's an illustration of the General Lincoln. And we don't have any photos going back that early, but it shows you what the boat looked like. And other later boats, by 1850, the original steamboat dock was at the end of, surprisingly enough, Steamboat Lane. And in 1830, but by 1850, it had moved back, as you can see, further down to where it is Barnes Wharf today. And so in 1850, the ship was the Mayflower, and here we see an ad in the Hingham Journal from April 1851, advertising that the steamboat Mayflower under the command of Captain Elijah Beale leaves 7:30 in the morning and comes back from Boston at 4:30 in the afternoon for a grand total fare of 15 cents. And they sometimes would stop at Hull on the way to pick up passengers. Now, I don't know necessarily, did people go to the dock and wave at the steamboat came by and they stopped? And of course, there's now a commuter boat stop at that place at Pemberton Bridge now. You could also load freight if you if you arrived about 15 minutes earlier and arranged for passage of that. There are, of course, ancillary businesses related to the steamer boat as they were with the horse industry. One of those businesses was hotels, resorts. By the 1850 era, many people were having more leisure time and wanted to get out of the more crowded and dirty cities to come out to the clean areas outside of town. And so the steamboats offered the opportunity for people to do that. And so that in order to profit on that possibility, the steamboat company actually in 1832 decided to build its own hotel, which they called the Old Colony House. And it is now on Summer Street at the hill overlooking the harbor. It's located on what became known as Old Colony Hill, which is, of course, the location where you meet Martin's Lane, and Summer Street turns to the right at the top of that hill. But eventually the steamboat company found it was unprofitable, so in 1837 they sold it off to more other interests to run the hotel, and they did that for good and bad until 1872 when it was eventually abandoned and burned down. And another related industry you might have is people who would transport you to and from the steamboat. Here you see an ad in the March 1850 Hingham Journal by Edwin Wilder saying that he would happily, if you want, come by his office, which is located at the Union Hotel, which is now the location of the post office at the corner of Fearing Road and North Street, and sign up. He would gladly pick you up or take you to the boat for 12.5 cents each way, or you could range through Boston, and you would have to pay 25 cents to do that. So in the late 1860s, and actually the steamboat became more popular, that there was actually competition in town. A man named Harvey T. Litchfield decided to buy the wharf, Cushing's Wharf, next to the Barnes Wharf, and it was renamed Litchfield Wharf, and he decided to run his own steamboat line, which he called the People's Line, and to compete directly with the Hingham and Boston steamboat line. And his boats were, first he had a boat called the Nantasket, and later it was a faster boat than the William Harrison, and the two Hingham steamboats were the John Romer and the Rose Standish. Here you see the John Romer at the dock later on in 1890. The fares drastically reduced during this time. It went from 25 cents in around 1867 to about 5 cents in 1870. And to try to corner the market completely for the last month of the season in 1870, the Hingham of Boston company decided to charge nothing for a trip to and from Boston, hoping to corner the market. I don't know if it worked right away, but by 1872, Litchfield gave up and put his efforts into establishing a steamboat dock at Nantasket. We don't, unfortunately, have a picture of any of his steamboats. So by 1850, actually, the newest option that you would see was the train. And the train came to town via the South Shore Railroad, which was established in 1848 and constructed tracks and opened the train service actually on January 1st, 1849. First president was Alfred C. Hersey of Hingham. The train ran from the Braintree where it tied into the existing Old Colony rail tracks. That train line opened in 1845 from Boston to Plymouth, and it ran along the coast to downtown Cohasset at that time. Here's a picture from about the 1890s showing the train going over the Water Street and Mill Cove areas of the town from the Hingham Cemetery. There was 4 stations in town. Downtown Hingham Station, there was one in West Hingham, there was one where the tracks crossed Summer Street called the Old Colony House, and there's one located where it crossed Hull Street called the Nantasket at that time. We saw the new train depot downtown. That is showing that's one of the very earlier pictures of the square. The tower you saw was taken down in 1863, so it had to be before that period of time. And the station was between Main Street and what is now Central Street along North Street. And here you see the frontage along North Street at that time, about 1860. And the train tracks ran along the bed of the old town brook, which required it to be put underground and piped in many locations, especially through downtown. So here we see the former Broad Bridge going over the creek, now turned into a railroad track, with a sign above it, which you can't really clearly see, but it says railroad crossing, look out for an engine if you hear a bell ringing. So to train people that there were no gates or anything at this time, you just had to be aware of every time you crossed train track that there might be a train coming. And you see the really recently completed Lincoln Building on the right of this photo. It's taken about 1861. And in addition to the train station downtown, there was a freight yard built along South Street. It's stored down where the Sherwin-Williams store in the parking lot is now. Here you see a 1890 photo of some hay being loaded onto the tracks at the freight yard. It also changed many streetscapes in town too. This is a photo around the 1890 looking at what's called Torrance Crossing. This is along South Street where a road prior to the Old Colony returning went between South and North Streets. South Street itself was very wide in West Hingham where the train's tracks, so the train tracks split South Street into 2 and left you with 2 South Streets, one running to the South Square, one running behind, as you now, is behind the laundry and the Wapello's Candy and that sort of thing. And they still have the 2 South Streets. We've been trying for years to, many people suggested changing the name of that other South Street so it's confusing, but it hasn't happened as of yet, right, Steve? So in 1849, when the trains ran, they started with 1 trip a day, 1 passenger car, maybe tied to 2 or 3 freight cars. Here's a notice from the March 8th, 1850 Hingham Journal saying that there now will be 2 runs a day, a regular train run and a new express run that would leave just for Cohasset and stop and leave them from Cohasset, stop at Nantasket, and then in Hingham. And if you use the new express train, you would be able to get to Boston for 15 cents. It took about an hour for you to get into the town. And by 1860s, even though the number of commuters that actually left from Hingham in 1865, they sort of had a census, and the state run a census and figured this out. There are about 45 commuters all told that left from Hingham at that time. But even that, there was increased use by the passenger cars during the era of the 2 or 3 passenger trains by 1867, and it rode about 6 to 8 trips per day by 1875. In 1871, the South Shore Railroad was leased to the Old Colony Railroad, and they expanded the line to Duxbury. Later, it went to Plymouth for a while, and the train demand became so high that people in South Hingham felt left out. They thought that they should have a train line on their own, so one was proposed to go through Norwell, parallel Main Street up to where Central Street is now, and then sort of cross over to the existing tracks on Fort Hill Street. They the supporters brought amendments and articles to town meetings over several years, in 1869 through 1872, but it never passed town meeting, either to improve of a train line or actually, in a couple cases, buy stock in the train line to help support construction. So in 1876, we're moving to a new era now. We're talking about the largely and now more of an industrial era. Here we have a photo I like, taken about sort of exemplary of that era. We're looking at a photo taken by Charles Marble from the steeple of the Congregational Church on Main Street. He's looking west. He's looking down Main Street towards the corner of Central Street, which looks awfully cold. It shows the several houses, including the the first Hingham High School building. So, and you had a lot of more options, more carriage traffic during this period of time. A lot of it was due not necessarily to industries in Hingham, which a lot of the industries were sort of dying out at that time, but had to do with increased resort traffic, especially in the summertime, and traveling through town and to other places. Hingham was becoming less and less of a resort town. So here's a map called a bird's eye map from 1885, showing the layout of the town at that time. Here you can point out that there's you can see a steamboat landing at the dock. You can see a train traveling across the Mill Pond area and the various streets at that time, including, yeah, there you go. And so it did see increased carriage and horse traffic. Here we see someone in a carriage passing the now Cushing House at the corner of Fearing Road and North Street around 1895. You can see in the back there's the Cushing House livery stables, the remainder of operation as part of that hotel. You also saw a lot more new delivery services. Charles T. Levitt had an ice making system. He carved ice out of the Cushing Pond during the winter, and he sold it during the summer. Here you see him traveling his ice cart along South Street around 1892. And you saw a lot more freight-related traffic. His Cobb's Hingham Express did most of his business taking freight and other things from the train stations to people in town. This was taken about 1897. And there's still a lot of strong supporting industries for the horse industry at that time. The 1885-86 Hingham Business Directory listed 3 harness makers, including a Henry Cushing at the harbor and a Hersey at the center. 3 hacks or barges or transportation-related business, including George Cushing at the Cushing House, several livery stables, including George Bassett at Main and Elm Street, which are right around across the street here. There's also one down at the Cushing House and one at Irving and Levitt Streets. Here's a picture of that livery stable about 1890 or so. You can sort of see the new fire hydrant that they put in at the time after the water came to the town. Now, there's also the horse industry benefited by better technology during this period as well. Here you see an ad in July, 1900 Hingham Journal regarding the new rubber carriage tire that was available at the M.K. Huntley shop, which he owned a horse shoery and jobbery shop at the corner of Water Street and Summer Street, where the fruit center is. Here's a picture of his shop around that time. As you can see, there's still horses and carriages about there, but you see a remnant of a new upcoming transportation option that I'll talk about soon. So what about steamships? Well, the steamships began to increase their peak travel during this period of time. The steamer John Andrew, a new steamer, which you see here, leaving the dock around in the early 1890s. And here you see on the bay, traveling to Boston, was joined by a new Benjamin Lincoln, General Lincoln steamer, and a couple outstanding steamers like the Rose Standish and the William Harrison from the People's Line. There were also more options as far as docks concerned to get into a steamboat into Boston. Here we see a page from the 1890 Crow Point resident directory telling people about the available steamboat schedule and train schedule. There's about 10 steamboats leaving for Boston, and you have about a dozen trains leaving as well, which just shows the upcoming competition between the train and the steamship, which the steamship eventually was losing out to the railroad. These other options, transportation options, and the dock options tended to curtail passengers in the Hingham dock itself. The steamboats didn't run in the wintertime, so you saw a boat docked into the steamboat and during the wintertime. And eventually, in 1881, the steamboat line was sold. New interests took it over, and they decided to concentrate more of their efforts on the resorts, Nantasket, and the new Melville Garden, which opened in 1871 on Crow Point, instead of Hingham. So you had only one boat going to the Hingham docks between 1881 and 1884. The steamboat line decided to change its name. We were incorporated. It was first the Hingham and Old Colony steamboat line. And in 1884, they changed it again to the Hingham, Hull, and Downer Landing Steamboat Company. And about that time, they restored 2 boats to the Hingham docks. But they reduced the number of runs. And so by 1890 or so, you only had 5 boats stopping at the Hingham docks or leaving the Hingham docks every day versus 11 to Nantasket and 8 from Downer Landing. And as a result of this, they decided to change their name finally again to the Nantasket Beach Steamboat Company, getting rid of Hingham out of the name entirely. And so the steamboat era ended in the inner harbor in 1898 after the Portland storm, named after the boat. It was sunk during that weather event in November of 1898. And here we see a photo taken after the storm showing the wrecked Hingham dock with a couple steamboats, the Miles Standish on the left, and a boat called the Hingham on the right, and what remains of the dock. The steamboat company owners surveyed and said it would take over $20,000 to build the dock, and they didn't want to put that investment in due to the number of passengers now leaving for Hingham. So in 1899 in the spring, they made an announcement that they would stop inner harbor steamboat service, and the steamboat would stop at Crow Point. The Downer Landing line had ended around 1890, after the season of 1896 when Melville Garden closed down, but they asked the town to restore the dock and dock there for there. So by 1900, here's an ad in the Hingham Journal for 1900, which indicates that in July 1900 there were only 1 trip from and 3 trips to the Crow Point dock compared to all the other docks they have in the line for Nantasket. So that leaves us next with what happened to the train. And actually the train during this time gained some speed, added inventory and tracks and lines to it. Here we see a train leading from the new Nantasket railroad line, which started from the Nantasket Junction, then the renamed Old Colony Hill was changed to Nantasket Junction, and the Nantasket Station changed its name to North Cohasset. Here we see the train depot around 1888 or 1889, large line of people waiting for the train, and a carriage waiting for possibly people to get off the train. 7,200 tickets were sold during that month. And this is a comparison showing the amount of daily departures to Boston or Hingham between 1888 and 1889. And you see it goes up almost triple between 1886 on a weekday and 1 on Sunday to 1900. You have 20 trips per day, weekdays, and 6 on Sundays. But we also had the industrial era, rather new way of transporting around called the bicycle. Here we see a group of young men in front of several model bikes around in the 1890s someplace. As you can see, there was one newer bike at the bottom, which is the more popular safety bike in 1885. And you see a couple older Columbia large wheel bikes in the back. A little history on bicycles. They were first invented way back in 1817 in Germany, but it wasn't until a man named Michel invented the Velocipede in France in the 1860s, got the reputation to be known as the Bone Shaker, which wasn't very complimentary name. Its design was adapted in what was in the U.S. by the Columbia Bicycle Company, and they created a high wheel bike in 1878. But again, there are a lot of safety problems with that. It got the reputation for being only for what they would say at the time, thrill-seeking young males, and versus other people in the general population. That changed with the safety bike in 1885, which had two smaller wheels and a chain drive to help drive it. This is the first really popular models of bicycles and tricycles. Here we see a gentleman in the Hingham Center on his tricycle in 1893. His name is David Cobb Sr., and he's with his dog. And you also saw ads in newspapers like this one from an 1889 Hingham Journal. You could rent actually bicycles or tricycles for the day or the week, 35 cents an hour, $5 a week. And if you didn't have, so you didn't have to own a bike to be able to use one. And bicycles became, everybody could use a bike or a tricycle. And here we see a young woman in Hingham Center around 1896 with her bike. And it was very popular, and the popularity of bicycles and the use of bicycles got the first need for a good roads movement in America. People assumed that this good roads idea started with cars, but it actually started with bikes in the 1880s, when the popularity, people wanted to use their bikes and wanted good roads to travel on them. So this spread throughout the country at that time. It actually sort of precedes that a little in Hingham. That was a shot of, this is a shot of Main Street with Pear Tree Hill being cut down around 1876. You're looking north towards the Home Meadows, and the hill along the left side will be cut down too. And a lot of effort went into what was called street straightening at that time, trying to increase traffic. People complaining of the large carriages and other traffic in the streets. Was the need for wider streets. So in 1876, most of the towns, 29 of the 68 town meeting articles regarded street improvements, widening, that sort of thing. And initially the selectmen were the road supervisors and responsible for overseeing widening of particular streets and roads and their improvements. But in 1884, basically the good roads people pushed through a bill in the legislature saying each town, each municipality should have its own street superintendent to oversee the street improvements. So Hingham hired Alonzo Kimball, and he started right away. On North Street, he widened that because in places between the harbor and West Hingham, the street was as narrow as 25 feet wide, which caused a lot of problems and bottlenecks of larger carriages at that time. In addition to street improvements, you did see new streets at this time. Oda Street, which initially was built from Samuel Downer down to Broad Cove area. With the help of the town, they extended that from across Broad Cove to Ship Street in 1877. Central Street, which was really just originally a sort of a path to the ropes works, factories along that area of town, was widened and built through to Elm Street in 1872 and finally to the square in 1895. And Lincoln Street, which stopped around the Crow Point area, Broad Cove Road area. In fact, the street area was extended to Weymouth. This allowed another alternative method for people to get to Weymouth and the turnpike that was built, which is now Beale Street through that part of Hingham. And of course, more roads led to more sidewalks and helpful for pedestrians, although the sidewalks weren't necessarily much better. Here we see what appears to be just a flattened dirt path along Main Street in Hingham Center. This shows that it's in front of the first Hingham Public Library, and this building burned down in 1879, so this picture was probably taken around 1876 or so. At sort of the end of the 19th century, saw the biggest improvement of all, the new option for town, the electric streetcar or trolley. Here you see a commemorative photo taken of the first Hingham streetcar afterwards. It was officially opened in June of 1896. Short history of the electric streetcar. It was first mentioned in 1899. Several people created and called an association for Weymouth Hingham rail line, and this lobbied people and investors to build a streetcar line in both towns. The 1890 investors were found and they started construction, but they did only in Weymouth, and it ended in 1891. And frustrated Hingham people got tired of waiting, so by 1893-94 they began lobbying the selectmen to say, we need our own streetcar line, we should have one ourselves. And finally, the selectmen relented in 1894, and they held a public meeting where most of the people supported the idea. the exception of being like prominent citizens such as Governor John D. Long, who later would be the first president of the Hingham Historical Society. He thought there's already too much traffic on the streets anyway, pedestrians and bikes and wagons and all this, and train crossings, that adding a streetcar would be a dangerous and unwelcome change, but his ideas didn't prevail. So the town passed along to the legislature a bill asking for a charter, and in 1895 the legislature approved that. And Hingham Street Railway Company was founded, and then they held their first stockholders meeting in January 1896, where they decided to build 18 to 19 miles of tracks, purchase about 18 to 19 open or summer cars, and about 5 to 6 closed or winter cars. And here you see a couple of the streetcars, number 36 and 39, being delivered to the freight yard on South Street. The first tracks were laid out at the corner of Fearing Road and North Street in about March of 1896. Cars started arriving in April and May. Here we see the arrival of a Nantasket Beach car and getting loaded onto from the South Street freight yards in May of 1896. And here you see a photo from the John P. Richard collection, owned by the Hingham Historical Commission and Society, filled one of the early streetcars with people on it traveling along Summer Street. The company decided to build a powerhouse and car barn on the harbor front, the former Eagle Iron Foundry location. And you see passing nearby that building. And they hired over 100 people, mostly from the Hingham Pipeline, to man the streetcars and other operations for the company. Here you see some of the streetcar employees in front of the car barn on Summer Street around 1900. And the streetcar line had very early success. You ran 4 different places. You could run to Nantasket along North Summer and Rockland Streets. You could run Queen Anne's Corner along Main Street. You could run it up Lincoln Street, and you could go through to Weymouth and then connect to Quincy along Lincoln Street, or you could take a connection to Downers Landing at Downer Avenue. The initial fare was 5 cents, including transfers. School children were charged a half rate for that. And the initial cars were run to Queen Anne's Corner every 30 minutes, and then they had Tasket every 15 minutes. And according to a history book, the last half of the 1896 order, around 450,000 people used the streetcar line at that time. Here you see a streetcar descending Pear Tree Hill from Queen Anne's Corner around 1898. And here you see a Nantasket Beach car at Liberty Pole Hill in the 1896 era. So this brings us to the 20th century and arrival of the horseless carriage. Illustrative of this is Postmaster Irvin Horton here sitting in his Stanley steamer in front of the former post office location on South Street. And he's waiting for download mail for delivery. Here's a map of what Hingham looked like in 1903, showing the basic routes and the centers of population. It's somewhat spread out from the downtown area along Main Street towards Queen Anne's Corner, and in the West Hingham area and towards Downer and Crow Point. Some quick automobile history. First, of course, the car didn't appear in 1900. It was largely invented through the invention first of the internal combustion engine in the 1880s, and then various manufacturers in the 1880s and 1890s. The first American factory is credited to the Duryea Motor Company wagon company in Michigan in about 1893. The first cars and models we would probably recognize came along in the early 1900s, including some GM cars in the early 1901-92. And the original Model A Ford, not the later one that came after the Model T, but the original one was built in 1903. The first Model T, the first popular car, was in 1908, although mass production didn't start until 1913. The first popular type you see is actually a wheel motor buggy, which is actually, as it describes, it's basically a motor buggy, but you put in the front, an engine in the front and steering wheels and various things to operate it. Reported the first Hingham automobile owned by the Hinghamite was by Francis Brewer, father of Wilman Brewer, the poet, who later contributed the Old Ordinary to the Historical Society in the name of its father in 1920 or so. And he didn't like the invention all that much. He ended up insisting on parking about 200 feet from his house, thinking it might blow up. So after having it a month or two, he sold it. And so, but despite that, Hingham still saw more increasing amount of automobiles. And by 1910, they actually had a Hingham Auto Club was formed. Here we see one of the earlier ads for an automobile in the Hingham Journal. This is from 1905. The first one I saw where somebody in Hingham was selling cars. This guy, Mr. Brigham on Ship Street, was selling 4 models of Cadillacs. You could have any color as long as it was booster green. And the models range from $750 to $2,800 at the time, so they weren't essentially cheap. And here we see what I call an early auto show. This was from the Richardson collection. It was scanned by Stephen Dempsey, thank you. Showing 4 early Ford models parked along South Street in 1909. I initially thought this was probably a gathering of the auto club, it's just that maybe it was a preliminary meeting of the auto club. Anyway, so to show that the cars were making their appearance in Hingham. But they didn't have much of an effect until a little after 1910, largely because cars were so relatively expensive. I saw an ad in the 1905 Hingham Journal with models priced between $900 and $250. I did a little back of the envelope calculation, and it's probably priced between $23,000 and $50,000 in all for the cost of that automobile at that time for today's dollars. So the town relied largely on horses for fire department and public works projects into the 1910s. Here is a fire brigade in front of their engine in front of one of the Hingham Fire Department buildings, using a horse for transportation. This could have been any time between 1900 and 1920 when the department became fully mechanized. Here you see a town meeting from 1915 asking the people to approve a resolution to approve the rate of their paying for rental horses for various public work projects to 25 cents a day. So they were still relying largely on horses to get things done in the mid-teens. But eventually the cars did have effect on other modes of transportation. The pedestrian traffic improved largely because improved sidewalks, and the cars largely got people were afraid of being in the street with the cars, so they encouraged the town to build more sidewalks. And starting in the early 1900s, they actually had a committee on sidewalks that was responsible for building them and reporting back to town meeting each year on the sidewalks. The concrete and gravel, or tar and gravel sidewalks they built. Here we see a report from 1924 saying that they built a tar and gravel sidewalk on Main Street between Garrison Road and Pond Street, and also on Green Street from Water Street to a property along Green Street. The street railway did continue to thrive in the early 1900s. Here you see the Hingham Square as a transportation hub. You see streetcars and pedestrians and horses and carriages and the train station all in one place. So it was a very busy area. And the advantage of the streetcar was that you could use it in all seasons, and pedestrians around town relied more and more on it. It brought the town closer together because you could make it to downtown from South Hingham in about 20 minutes, and you could attend meetings and social groups in that downtown and go back home quite easily. Here we see a couple streetcars passing through on Main Street, passing the Second Parish Church around 1900. And the trolleys were not just Hingham, but they were interconnected to other town streetcar lines, as you see on this map. So any hub, such as Sleepy Hingham Center you saw in that previous photo, can be connected to the wider world. Here you see where the streetcar line in Hingham connects to car lines in Weymouth and to Boston and North, and places far to the south. And they started publishing streetcar guides in the 1900s. This one, 1905, lists how you could get from Boston to Nantasket by streetcar, for instance, or Boston to Brockton. Also little things how to get you to New Hampshire, and a little sidebar on how you could get from New York to Philadelphia by streetcar. Despite that, in the later 1910s, railway patronage began to decline precipitously. And the streetcar company that had been consolidated into Eastern Mass, in this case they will call the Bayside Street Railway Company. And despite that, with the loss of revenue, they couldn't maintain the tracks well. Here you see an article in the fall 1916 Hingham Journal saying that the streetcar line is threatening to close the Main Street line to Queen Anne's Corner because they don't feel that the track is safe enough to travel on during the winter time. They said they may or may not be able to restore it by spring. and it showed that what was happening to the streetcar line. By the 1920s, actually, the car lines had to be subsidized by the town to keep running. In this case, in 1921 and 1922, the town passed articles that give now the Eastern Mass Electric Street Railway Company $5,000 each year to help maintain the streetcar lines. Despite that, by 1924, the company reported a loss of about $15,000 per year, and the town decided that it wasn't sustainable and gave up on subsidizing the streetcar. In the meantime, you saw the service stopped on the lines in Hingham, Lincoln Street, and Danner Avenue in 1916, and along North and Summer to Nantasket in 1921. There was still a railroad over there until the Depression years, and the remaining lines were closed down in 1926. As we saw, the steamboat service was now restricted in 1901 to the Crow Point Landing, and it would end up surviving much pure in 1904. Here you see from the Richardson collection is steamboat schedule from August 1904, listing only one landing and one pickup from Crow Point. In the spring of 1904, the steamboat company approached the town again to repair the docks at Crow Point to keep the steamboat running, but there wasn't enough that they didn't do, because in April 1905, when they announced the new steamboat season was open, they did list a landing at Crow Point, but when they printed the actual schedule when the steamboat started to run in May, no more stops at Crow Point, and that ended the Hingham steamboat era. The train, though, kept rolling on and on, at least through World War I. Here we see a schedule listed in the Hingham Journal in 1914. It showed that there were still 19 runs to Boston at that time. But the train kept starting to lose money, and it showed up in the maintenance and ability to run trains. The still unreliability of steam trains fueled by coal during the World War I era hurt them, because a lot of coal shortage happened during the war, and they cut back on the number of runs per day. Here we see an article in the November 1918 Hingham Journal about losing 4 more trains due to coal shortages along the line. And the reason for all these declines in other transportation industries, of course, a lot of cars now did this. This is a little table I did of a number of license plates issued by the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles. Massachusetts was the first state to issue license plates starting in 1903. Actually, this takes it from 1908 to 1924 in the number of thousands of plates. And you see there's about 20,000 in 1908, but it goes to 100,000 in 1916, and it goes to 225,000 in 1920, and it goes to 300 and more than 450,000 in 1924. Needless to say, cars were flooding the roads at that time, and people didn't really have need for these other transportation options. And the reason for the cars flooding the market, they were much cheaper. Of course, the assembly line that Henry Ford started in 1913 spread to other auto factories, and the manufacturers started lowering the prices of their cars. And this ad from the Ford dealer in Hingham in 1918, you see that touring cars started $360 compared to what you saw $800 to $1,500 before. You would even get a truck for $600. So a lot more people could buy cars than they were. So this brings us to the transportation businesses that change. One of the highlighted people in the Richardson collection is a man named James E. Kemp, who originally had a carriage repair business on South Street in 1895. By 1905, he started the first auto car repair facility. And after the streetcar line didn't need a power station anymore in 1909, they decided to get their power directly from a generating plant in Braintree. Mr. Kemp moved his business into the streetcar garage and started the trend of cars and car-related businesses along the harborfront on Summer Street. You saw also during this time streetscapes change, more cars. As you see the South Street in 1926 in the winter. You see in front of the train station a lot of cars, and you don't see any horses there or anything, just cars. The major problem, of course, was the traffic not in town but through town. initially to places like Nantasket Beach. Here's a photo taken in July 4th, early 1920s, of all the cars going to Nantasket on the weekend. Now, where all those cars come through? Hingham, of course. And they did a count on one of the days, and let me find all of him here. Yeah, okay, so over the counted on 1 July 4th in 1914, about 3,000 cars went through Hingham Square on one Sunday on the way to Nantasket. So the town, started, and people going through town started lobbying the state to say, we got to do something to improve this. So Hingham decided to lobby for a bill that would build a bypass around the Hingham Square area. That passed in 1915. Here you see a picture of the newly the open boulevard looking towards the Otis Street area in 1923. You got 3,200 cars in 1914. The state started surveying routes in 1915 all from the Lincoln Thaxter and Downer Ave intersection all the way to the corner of Hall Street and Rockland Street, west corner. But by 1918, they couldn't decide on the path east of the square, east of Summer Street, so they decided just to build between Lincoln Street and Summer Street by building along, widening Bear Cove, the Broad Cove Road area, and down on Otis Street and extending Otis to North and Summer Streets. And here we see how they started demolishing buildings along the harbor front of what the street called Harbor Street, which ran initially along the waterfront in the period of early 1918. And the road building was finished in 1919, and here you see a photograph from a state report on that construction. In 1920, showed a widening extension of Otis Street looking towards Summer Street. You can see the house on Cottage Street along the right on the bluff there. So we get to the last period of time, 1926 to 1950, car as a rule. And here you see some children interested in a new model car. They probably one of their fathers just built around 1930. We now see the existing other happens to the other transportation modes. For the streetcar, like I said, the streetcar service ended in 1926, and over the next few years, the town started paving over the streetcar lines to make it safe for cars. The street railway service was now provided through buses. Ironically, the Eastern Massachusetts Street Railway Company, the last owner of the trolley cars, began running buses, and here we see a notice in 1946 about them changing its schedule to downtown Hingham. Horses were, of course, put out to pasture for the most part. You see them on the farms. You see them, maybe occasionally on special occasions. This horse here, seen here, is leading people and costume actors from Old Ship Church during the tercentennial pageant in 1935. From there, train travel started being reused as well. This picture is from the This Is America book taken by Francis Cook McGregor in 1941. It shows a long line of people getting on the train, but what should be revealed is instead of about 19 trips per day, they were down to less than 10. And so more people had to travel at the same time to get into Boston. And the trains did try to modernize its service to attract more riders in the 1930s. They started using diesel locomotives and more modern designs. This is a pass-through by a new diesel design called the Comet, which didn't run on Hingham Line, but did travel between Boston and Providence, but it was here on a little tour to promote train service through Hingham Square in 1935. As you can see, by 1940, the train was really losing money, and they started threatening to cut back on the number of fewer trips into Boston and back. The citizens started forming groups to keep lobbying for these unprofitable scheduled trains, and that continued to the war. But in 1946, the New Haven Railroad, the Gold Colony was now owned by the New Haven, New York, and Hartford Railway, that declared bankruptcy. And as part of the reorganization agreement with the government, they decided they would continuing the train service south of Boston, but it would be only if they didn't exceed a certain amount of money loss, which happened in 1948. And here you see an article in the Hingham Journal from February of that year, later, and this is April of 1848, saying that after they decided they would cut service in October, the state decided to step in and offer two plans to the people. One, keep the Greenbush line going, will allow them to cut service more, increase fares, and allow you to keep your train, or we can allow the Metropolitan Transit, Boston's Metropolitan Transit Association, to take over the train tracks and run trains down further from Boston to Braintree, and you can get on the train there. Well, that's sort of a precursor to the Red Line, what happened later on. But many people in the South Shore area in Hingham were not particularly amused by having to travel to Braintree to get on the train, so they successfully lobbied to keep the trains running, although by this time there's now only one trip in and out per day, and they were heavily advertised in papers. Here you see an advertisement in the 1948 Hingham Journal telling you can take the train, you can read your paper on the way in, and it's only very convenient, and it's only 80 cents to Boston on Sundays. But in 1949, still not attracting enough riders, they approached the town saying, we will build you a completely new, modern-looking train station to help attract more people to the train. We will allow businesses, commercial businesses in the front of the station to give us money to help subsidize the train service. And all you have to do is approve our plan. And so they did. And then almost immediately in the summer of 1949, they began to tear down the old Hingham train depot. This is a picture taken from the corner of Central and North Street around in summer of that year. And a new station was built in its place, a smaller station. Here you see an operation around late 1950 with a bus in front of it. You may recognize the building is now the home of the Square Cafe and the former home of the Bulletin Board. It's still there today, but as this particular use as a station only lasted until 1954, when it was moved to the newly fill-in Mill Cove on now Station Street. Bicycles, going back to looking at what bicycles were, by the 1920s, they were largely seen as a child's toy, so no longer an effective means of alternative transportation. So you basically saw advertisements for bicycles for children, and usually tricycles were for very small children. They were for adults. So one of the new things that happened in Hingham in the 1930s was we actually got an airport for a while. Here you're looking at a photo of the Bayside Airport. It was established by Peter Bradley of the Bradley Fertilizer Works in 1935. You can see the fertilizer works across the back river from the airport. It was his former horse farm and polo grounds. He transferred into making a landing strip for airplanes. Not only both land landings, but water landings only. About 1936 to 37, Hingham had his first and only airmail trip from the airport. But they assumed it was very profitable to do it that way. So let's go back to ground delivery. This is from John P. Richards' collection, the only photo I could find of the airport in action. Here you see a horse and sleigh meeting up with a plane sometime around 1936 wintertime. But the airport closed in 1938. And so the town was approached, people in town said, well, maybe we should have a municipal airport. So of course they appointed a committee, and it studied that in 1939 and reported to the town meeting in 1940 that maybe if the town could buy some land on Scotland Street, sort of the Wampanoag Pretty Park area now, it could be turned into an airport. But their opinions didn't sway much of the town meeting people, so they put it off both in 1940, 1941, and then World War II came, and priorities shifted, and nothing came out of that. So we're officially in the auto age at this time. A lot of new roads were built in the 1930s, and more were proposed. Here we see looking at the new Justice Cushing Highway, looking towards the harbor, and the Harbor Rotary just after that was opened, 1933, 1934. The state built the George Washington Boulevard to Hall. It was actually the finishing of the original plan from the 1910s. And they named it after George Washington. It was officially opened in 1932 on the bicentennial of his birth. Summer walk-on streets between the harbor and the new boulevard were widened to 4 lanes to help traffic get there. In the spring of 1933, the new Justice Cushing Highway was built to take traffic off local roads, mostly in Cohasset, but Hingham and Scituate. And it removed traffic between Harbor and Scituate, and it was completed in the spring of 1933. Many people, it was completed only a year, which is different from road construction projects at that time. One of the major issues during that time is this was a depression, and people in Hingham were hoping to get a lot of jobs out of this, but they ended up giving the jobs to a statewide contract, and so people all over the state worked. And people from Hingham didn't think they were paid, who were working there didn't think they were paid as well, so they all had to strike. But it still, despite all this, it opened on time. And the new highway ended at the rotary, as we saw. This is the view looking south from the rotary in about 1941, showing how it looked at that time, street loops at that time. Here's a map. This is one of the earliest maps I could find in 1933, which shows the new highway system. It includes the new Justice Cushing Highway and George Washington Boulevard, and it shows the major streets, Main Street in town. And it shows in some of the streets were marked with root shields, which is another new issue at that time, which will come up later on. So most of the streets, many of the streets besides the main streets, which was here, were paved. This is actually looking at Main Street about 1935. Traveling north through the Glad Tidings Plain. It's from South Pleasant Street. This is probably what Main Street sort of looked like when Eleanor Roosevelt came to town in 1942 and May, or some people say may not, said it was the most beautiful Main Street in America. The Harborfront expanded the streets in the Harborfront, became home to Auto Central more. Here you see a view from North Street showing the car dealerships, various gas stations. Here you see looking the other direction, near in front where the Mobil station is today. You see across the street a Hudson dealer. You're standing in front of a gas station. You're looking at down the left towards a Ford dealership, and behind the house on the right there near the end of the view is another car dealer on Whitney Wharf. In addition to seeing a lot of car dealerships, you saw more ads in the Hingham Journal for cars. I point these two out because one was a Hudson ad for Hudson cars, which says it's a preview of the future. I know you're happy for all your Hudson cars you have in your garages now. And one on the right is a used car dealership was in town, and you don't know necessarily how used cars got bad reputation, but here we have in Hingham, you could get a used car from a crook. Carl Crook sold used cars. He was the guy to a safe place to buy used cars at the harbor. And here you see a big one-page advertisement for the new Beaumar motor sales business on Whitney Wharf. This in 1946. A few years later, they'd sell out to Wolf Sullivan, Chrysler. They ended up being the last car dealer on the harbor when the town purchased the location in the late 1980s and tore it down. As I said, there are also many gas stations in town. There are about at least probably a dozen at some time between the Rotary and South Street downtown. And in many other cases, you don't necessarily think of gas stations these days. Here we have one in Hingham Center. This would eventually become Cushing's Garage. This was the Saucony gas station in about 1935, corner of 11th and Main Streets. And here you see a grand opening announcement from 1949 in the Journal about a new city service gas station on South Street. And you may know where the building is in the back of the CVS parking lot where this is located. And here you see Hingham Square traffic in 1949. Lots of cars in the middle of traffic, while you still see the train station being demolished. So one of the other major innovations that Hingham got in the 1930s was route numbers officially established. This is the first route numbers that came to town were part of the New England Interstate Route System, established in the 1922s among all the states in New England and Eastern New York. They put route numbers on largely established routes. Route 6 was given to the Cape Way route between Boston and Cape Cod and Plymouth, while 6A was given to the coastal route. By 1927, though, the U.S. route system was established, and this put the end to the New England route system and changed numbers a bit. And so we have Route 3 along the inland route and 3A along the coastal route. And along Main Street in 1929, we had Route 18. And I know you're saying Route 18, that's in Weymouth. Well, it is in Weymouth now, but it ran from 123 in Rockland to the intersection of East Street and Summer Street in Hingham. And here, it wasn't signed. Maybe people say, well, maybe it wasn't signed. Well, this is a house tour booklet, not by the Historical Society, but by another agency supporting the Wilder Memorial Nursery School. In 1930, they have a map, and they show Route 18 along Main Street and East Street. It also shows up in a 1930 map of a town. And the town thought that the intersection of Route 18 and Route 3A at the corner of East and Summer Street might be developed commercially. So that's why they purchased what that little park now on the island between Kilby, Main and Summer Streets was to prevent development of that area. So in 1931, Route 18 disappeared and eventually appeared back in Weymouth and to the south of there, and we got Route 128, which was a new circumferential route around Boston, and extended from its first end at Derby and Whiting Streets, along Whiting and then up Main Street, East Street and all the way to Nantasket. And during this time, both in 1930 and 1931, the state took to redeveloping the route of the 128 and closed parts of the route at times for a couple of months and widened and straightened it. And the town contributed 1/3 of the cost, or $17,000, to do that. And immediately after the route was completed, traffic showed up on Main Street, and people started complaining. And the state started to say, well, maybe we'll probably eventually move 228 to a bypass to the east. And they suggested in 1941 that maybe they should build a traffic circle in Hingham Center, but people there would result in tear down some of the buildings there, fought that, and the town agreed with them. Here we see a 1931 map showing the construction along 128 and Main Street. The red box is saying that this part of the road was closed from like September through November of 1931. Here we have an example of what some of the rebuilt Route 128 looks like. We have the corner of Hingham Center, corner of Short Street and 11th Street. You see in front of the Little Plain Candy store there, there's a small 128 marker. And here in 1935, the town took a step to get improved traffic situation by putting up stoplights. Here you see a quite busy Queen Anne's Corner for the time in 1935 with the stoplights installed. Major changes to the streetscape happened in World War II, mostly in North Hingham. The arrival of the shipyard along Lincoln Street. Here you see a spring 1942 photo by the Navy Department showing the near completion of the bridge for 3A over what would be the train tracks between the two sides of the shipyard on both sides of Lincoln Street. In addition to building that bridge, which during that was construction, they detoured traffic to Beale Street and back on Flotler Road. They built a new Back River Bridge, a much higher one to allow vessels to get to the ammunition depot on the Back River. And here we see an example of the cars of the time, and the administrative building is being built across from the shipyard along Lincoln Street, one of them which would eventually become North School for the town. And in 1942, the state took over a lot of built streets in town between what was the ammunition depot at now Bearcoat Park and the Cohasset Annex at Wampatuck, and to improve them for truck traffic. And so they straightened parts of Beale Street, Fort Hill, New Bridge, Cross Street, High, Free, and Union Streets, and then returned them back to the town. There was some more continuing widening for cars after the war. We see the proposed widening of South and Main Streets at the corner, right down here. Some of you may take advantage of the new wider Main Street in parking for this talk. So Hingham in 1950, the population is about 11,000 people. And mostly people rely on their car to get around. There's still some vestiges of the old transportation system. You see the new Hingham train station and train crossing by St. Paul's, surrounded by cars parked in the street. And so we saw the American move towards the highway, which and the car being dominant, and this happened until probably the early 1960s, and since then we've seen sort of a retreat and a sort of a return to more options of transportation, perhaps coming circle in the next more than 70 years. It started out with the end of the railroad in 1959, but by the mid-60s, after Route 128 became Route 228, the state wanted to build an expressway, and the town decided to reject that. Boston people rejected the highways through their town. And more effort was put on public transportation. The boats returned in 1975 at Hewitt's Cove, and the train returned in 2007. And a few years ago, the town actually established official bike routes as some alternative forms of transportation in town. So that's where you got from here to there to here. Okay, so thank you. That's any questions you may have? Thank you.
Do you know, I think it said 1968, the town rejected an 228 expressway. Was that the one that was proposed to go through what is now Wampatuck?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And why did they reject it, do you know?
Well, a lot of the traffic, like it caused a disruption. in the early 60s, when it was first proposed, many of the town officials approved of the plan and sort of pushed it forward. But it sort of, the support for roads and road construction started waning in the late 60s, and people were, saw the disruption, and this is sort of the, era started of preservation, and people saw a lot of it. It would have run down near where the Cushing Farm is now along East Street. It would have run along crossing the Weir River down by across the harbor in that area. So it would have been very disruptive to those areas of town.
But now when you see Main Street, you think there should have been some kind of a solution like that. Might have saved all that traffic.
Yeah, well, it comes back from time to time.
Yeah.
But now that we have the state park there, it's probably almost impossible to get some road through there now. So
Yeah.
Perhaps we move away from cars and we'll have less traffic and stuff. So.
More questions?
Bob, great talk. Your attention to detail and your grasp of the facts and the timelines and everything are just superb. I'm wondering if you could comment, if you know any detail in terms of the demographics in Hingham and those people that were commuting into Boston for jobs. It seemed like the ferries were originally, they were taking some passengers in, but freight seemed to be a major component of that. And I'm just wondering, at what point did it seem that perhaps many residents of Hingham were working, say, in Boston and needed to get into Boston for jobs as opposed to simply commerce-related activities?
Yeah, well, you don't see a lot of commuters into town until really the town became more of a suburb, sort of styled itself as a streetcar suburb of Boston, sort of early 1900s. Like I said, around 1865 or so, there were about 45 people identified as commuters going into work in Boston. This increased to like about 80 in about 1875, and about 130 or 40 by 1885, 1890. So there wasn't and the population of Hingham at that time was about 5,000, 6,000 people. So there wasn't really a whole lot up to that time of people who had offices in Boston and worked there. You did see a lot of people who, lived down here during the summer and moved back into Boston during the winter time. And maybe some of those people used the steamships when they're here in the summer, but you saw a lot more increase in use of the railroad as a frequent better use of their transportation. The original the steamers were in Boston went in sort of where the Long Wharf is, sort of north end area is now. But after the Boston fire of 1872 or so, parts of that area were burned down, and they moved it towards where the Rose Wharf area, closer to the financial type area of town. And so that might have helped a little at the time for more people taking the boat, but I still think that most people, since the steamboat only arrived in the summertime, it was more catered to the tourist trade than the working people. A little more expensive probably and stuff than the train. So you saw more people using the train as time went on.
Yes, when I was working at the Old Ordinary, taking 5th grade classes through, we were told that there were 2 boats at one time, one for the Whigs and one for the Tories, because they wouldn't ride together. And
Yeah.
I thought it was a very appropriate thing for today's problems that we're having. Is that true?
Yes, for the packet boats prior to the steamboat era in early 1800, yes, there was boats that catered to the Federalist side and more to the other to the Jeffersonian side, and so yes, they were. And you wouldn't, if you belonged to one group, you wouldn't dare be seen on the boat with the other group, even if that was the only boat that was leaving, and you had to stay in town in Boston or find other transportation to get home. You wouldn't get on the other boat, supposedly.
More questions? Well, I just wanted to thank our, not just speaker, but Bob has put so much effort into telling this comprehensive story of transportation. So this is a small token of our appreciation on behalf of the Education Committee. Thank you.